and holidays. And I've cried for all your troubles. Smile at your funny little ways. We watched our friends grow up together, and we saw them as they fell. Some of them fell into heaven. Some of them fell into hell. I took shelter from a shower, and I stepped into your arms. On a rainy night in Soho, the wind was whistling all its show. I sang you all my sorrow. You told me all your joys. Whatever happened to that old song? To all those little girls and boys. Sometimes I'd wake up in the morning, the ginger lady by my bed, covered in a cloak of silence. I'd hear you talking in my head. I'm not singing for the future. I'm not dreaming of the past. I'm not talking after the first time. I never think about the last. Now the song is nearly over. We may never find out what it means. Still, there's a lot of hope for me. You're the measure of my dreams. The measure. Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Nunkie Arms, the first time in 4 months, I think. God, a lot of water has flowed under the bridge in Santa. Who have we got? Chasmina, welcome from Florida. Welcome back. Haven't heard from you for a while. Bill Booker, hello, Bill from Leicestershire. Paul Dean, Grimsby. Belinda and family, I hope, in Warrington. Jody in Wolverhampton. Gary and Pauline, I think, in Scotland somewhere. So here we are. Very good to see everybody. I hope you all had good Christmases. And it's 43. We're doing okay. Then it's kind of a little less than our average, I think, but other people will perhaps join. Yeah, it's soggy here up in Southport too. Well, one little boring note to make. I couldn't get my printer to work this afternoon. So what I'll be doing, and if this works, it may become a common practice. Normally I read from paper, but I should be reading from the screen in front of me, kind of, more like an auto cue, I suppose. And if that works out, then I may adopt it as regular practice. But the story that I'm going to read tonight was written and read aloud almost exactly 120 years ago to the night. This time last week, 120 years ago, It was read aloud over 2 successive nights in King's College, Cambridge, at a gathering hosted by the great hero of mine, M.R. James. Now, at the same gathering, M.R. James himself read 2 ghost stories. He read number 13, which has appeared in the Nunkie Arms before. I don't even remember. It was live from Jutland a couple of years ago, from Viborg, the town where it's set. And he also read a story which was referred to at the time by a friend under the title Fur Flabis, but which we know better today as Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which I'm sure most of you will also be familiar with. Now, the story I'm going to read tonight isn't by M.R. James. It's by his great friend Arthur Benson, A.C. Benson. Now, I have done this before. I don't think at the Nunkie Arms, but I think during the behind closed door seasons during one of the lockdowns. But I wanted to try it again because it's something that I just want to refamiliarize myself with. You'll also find it in the anthology Ghosts of the Chit Chat, which is the anthology I edited a couple of years ago, and on the sequel of which I'm currently working. And it's called, well, it seems to have been originally called The House of Traheel. And during his lifetime, Arthur Benson didn't seem to have any intention of publishing it. But after he died, his brother, E.F. Benson, also himself, of course, a great writer of ghost stories, discovered among his papers a sheaf of supernatural tales. And it seems that he got rid of most of them, but 2 of them he published as a kind of posthumous tribute to his brother. And this was one of them, and it was published under the title Basil Netherby. So it's Basil Netherby that I'm going to read to you tonight. Now, apparently when he first read it out loud in 1903, he'd started writing it that morning and hadn't finished it. So he read the first half and then said, I got to stop there, folks. Next morning, woke up, wrote the second half and read that. So I've divided it in the middle and we will have our usual interval. But first of all, I'm gonna open the Badger Brewery, which is, one of my favourites. It's rebranded itself in I don't know, slightly irritating way. It's a kind of, they've anthropomorphized the badger. So I'm not sure what he's supposed to be there. It's supposed to be some kind of home guard character. Anyway, we'll see if the beer tastes the same. Well, Chaz, you call them a dynamic duo, Benson brothers. There were 3 of them. In fact, they were a trio. There was another brother called R.H. Benson, who was a very odd man who also wrote ghost stories with a very Roman Catholic flavor to them. He became a Roman Catholic priest, and he wrote ghost stories that kind of, promoted the faith. But they're actually quite good. All right, so if I look different than I usually do, it's because I'm reading from the screen. Now, I wonder if I can, hang on. Okay, hang on, nearly that. Sorry, I should have done this before. All right. Basil Netherby by Arthur Benson. It was at 5 o'clock of an October afternoon that Basil Netherby's letter arrived. I remember that my little clock had just given its warning click when I've heard footsteps approaching my door, and just as the clock began to strike, there came a hesitant knock. "Come in," I called out, and after some fumbling with the handle, into the room steps the shyest clergyman that I've ever seen in my life. He shook hands like an automaton. He was quite unable to look me in the eye. And as he introduced himself, Vivian was his name, he went quite pink in the face. And then he handed me the letter and told me that it was from my friend Basil Netherby, and that Netherby was very well, remarkably well, in fact, quite a different man from what he'd been when he first arrived in Treheil. He himself, he stuttered, was the curate of St. Sibby, and Treheil was the name of the house where Mr. Netherby had settled. Now, the letter had been most important, he thought, because Mr. Netherby had asked him to deliver it into my own hands without fail. He couldn't, however, account for the extraordinary condition in which he was compelled to hand it over, as it had never, as far as he knew, left his own pocket since he'd first received it. And then, with a sort of a gasp, Mr. Vivian was gone, having refused all offers of entertainment. Now, I was living back then in a little street near Holborn, trying to get up a connection in the teaching line. It was slow work, and my prospects did not appear at all cheerful, but I was struggling on. Basil Netherby had been with me at the College of Music, studying composition. Pleasant fellow, retiring, I think you'd probably say, and with an odd streak of something about him, genius perhaps, or eccentricity, which set him apart from other men. We'd become friends and had lodged together for some months. Basil would often show me his compositions, and although they sometimes broke down rather oddly in places, there was always something about them, I sensed, an air of aiming high, an attempt to realise the ideal. He was a talented man, there's no doubt of that. He left the college before I did, saying that he'd learnt all that he could from other men and must now go into the country alone to work. And after that, I only heard from him very fitfully. First, he was in Wales, and then Devonshire, and then Cornwall. And then, 3 months before this latest letter arrived, the correspondence had ceased. I took up the envelope now that Mr. Vivian had bought, and I saw that, yes, as he'd suggested, it was in a very, very extraordinary condition. One of the corners looked like it had been nibbled by mice, and there were disagreeable stains on both sides of it, as though Mr. Vivian's pocket had been filled with raspberries, a theory which, though not improbable, did not appear impossible. But what surprised me most was that near each of the corners on the front, a rough cross of ink had been scrawled, and another one at the back of the flap. Well, I suppose that Mr. Vivian himself had, in a nervous and absent mood, harried the poor envelope into this condition and been unable to bring himself to own up to the maltreatment. I tore it open. Several pages of manuscript music fell out, and the letter, in which Basil, in a bold, firm hand, said that he'd been working very hard and had made good progress in his art. He enclosed a recent piece which he said he hoped I'd like, but he insisted that he wanted a candid opinion. He added that he'd secured good quarters at a delightful farmhouse not far from Grampound. And that appeared to be it. But no, that was not entirely it. The letter seemed to finish on the third side, but as I closed it, I saw written on the fourth page, in a small, weak hand, as if scribbled in some haste, another short paragraph, which went as follows. Vivian will take this, and for God's sake, Leonard, if you would help a friend on the edge, come to me tomorrow, uninvited. You will think this very strange, but do not mind that. Only come unannounced. Be certain to be unannounced, and you will see why. The line broke off in an unintelligible flourish, and I noticed that on each corner of this page also crosses had been scrawled in black ink with the same ugly and slovenly haste as the crosses on the envelope. Well, my first thought was that poor old Basil had lost his wits. My next was that he'd drifted into some awkward social situation. He'd always been singularly innocent of worldly matters, I reflected, and yes, it seemed entirely plausible that someone, some unscrupulous woman perhaps, in the remote country spot where he was living, was playing on my poor friend's sensitive nature by some threat of nameless disclosures, some vile and harrowing innuendo. I read the letter again, and still more clearly did it seem to me that Basil was frightened of something. Now, I was looking for a timetable to see how quickly I could get to Grandpound when a now familiar shuffling footstep drew up to my door, and Mr. Vivian again entered the room. Now, this time, his confusion was even greater than before. He'd forgotten, he said, to give me a further message, and he handed me another filthy scrap of paper, nibbled and stained, just like the envelope. And then he apologized several times, uttered a strangled cough, and stumbled from the room. Now, it was no easy job deciphering the writing on this new piece of paper, but it was clearly a musical phrase. I puzzled over it, and then in a moment I saw that it was a phrase from an old composition of Basil's, a credo which we'd often discussed together, the grim and rather fantastic accompaniment to the sentence, "He descended into hell." Well, I hesitated no longer. I found that I could be at Grandpound by 6 o'clock the next morning. So I ordered a hasty dinner, packed a few things in a bag, and then, as often happens on such occasions, I found that I still had 2 or 3 hours to go until my train left. And so I took up Basil's new score and I read it through carefully. Yeah, well, I mean, he certainly improved in his handling. That was true, but good grief, what music this was. It was like nothing I'd ever dreamed of, still less heard. I mean, it was wild, intemperate, voluptuous. That was it. It was, oh, well, there was a kind of evil relish of beauty about it, which gave me a painful thrill. I mean, to make sure that I wasn't mistaken, I put the manuscript in my pocket and I went over to see Marcus Grierson, a fellow musician who lived not far away. He'd had a slight acquaintance with Basil, and when I mentioned that I'd received some new music from him, his interest was obvious. "Ah, yes," he said, "Netherby. Yeah, promising fellow, I always thought, if a bit transcendental. Let's see what he's up to then." He took the score, settled his spectacles on his nose, and began to read. And then after a few minutes, he looked up at me, and I saw in his expression that he'd found something of the same incomprehensible sensuality which had so oddly affected me. "Gosh," he said, "now this is very strange stuff. We got to listen to this." And he went over to his piano. Now, heard upon the instrument, the accent of evil that ran through Basil's music became even more manifest, and I struggled now between two emotions. One was an overpowering admiration for the undoubted skill that was displayed, and the other was a strong sense of shame at my capacity for admiring it. Grierson was even more moved than I, and he broke off in the middle of a bar. "Good God, this is filth," he said. "Take it away from me." And he tossed the score towards me. I mean, it's clever stuff, of course, hideously clever, but I know, I'm sorry, the man has no business to think of things like this. I don't like it, Lionel, and you can tell Netherby from me that it won't do. Good heavens, and to think he used to be a decent sort of fellow. Well, I put the music away and we tried to talk of other things, but neither of us could get those tainted notes out of our heads. So eventually I took my leave, caught my train, and as I was whirled to the west, I fell into a troubled sleep. It was peaceful and still when we drew up at Grandpound Station. I inquired my way to Treheal and was told that it was 3 or 4 miles away. Now, there was no chance of obtaining a vehicle, apparently, so I decided to walk, hoping that I'd be freshened by the morning air. Presently, a lane struck off from the main road and led up a wooded valley with a swift stream. In 2 or 3 places, the chimney of a deserted mine stood out beside the road, and at one point, a square church tower peered solemnly over the trees. Eventually, I came to a small thatched lodge standing among some firs. Now, the building itself seemed to be deserted, but the gate beside it stood wide open, and so I struck off along a path into the wood. After half a mile or so, the track took a sudden turn, and then, straight ahead of me, appeared suddenly a large Georgian house of brown stone with a gravel sweep up to the front door, all overgrown with grass. There was a stone portico at the front, crowned with a pediment and projecting wings to the left and right, which threw the front door into shadow. I must say that from the very start, the house displeased me. I mean, it was substantial, homely perhaps, but the wood came extremely close up to it on all sides, and with its shuttered windows, it seemed to stare back at one with a look of dumb resentment. Smoke was rising from a chimney to the left, so I pulled a large handle which hung beside the door, and eventually footsteps were heard within, and the door was opened slowly by a pale little woman with a timid, downcast air. "Hello," I said. I wondered, does a Mr. Netherby live here?" "Aye, he do lodge here, sir." "Well, I wonder if I could see him, please." "He's not up yet, sir." "Does he expect you?" No, not exactly, but he'll know my name. It's Lionel Ward." I've actually travelled rather a long way to see him." The woman looked at me, and I was suddenly aware, by some swift intuition, that I was in the presence of a distressed spirit, one who was labouring under some melancholy prepossession. "Will you be here long?" she said suddenly. No, I won't be here long, but I shall have to stay the night, I think." "Oh, no, look, sorry, I've travelled all last night, and I'm really rather tired. Might I sit down somewhere and wait until I can see Mr. Netherby?" She seemed to consider for a moment, and then she led me into the house. We entered a fine hall with stone flags and pillars on each side. As far as I could see in the half light, there were faded portraits on the walls and some indistinct pieces of furniture in the corners. We went down a passageway and turned into a large, rather bare room, which showed, however, some signs of human habitation. There was an old piano in the corner, a few books were lying about, and on the walls again, these pictures in tarnished frames. I put down my bag, I sat down next to the fire, and almost instantly I fell into a doze. I awoke with a start to find Basil Netherby standing at my side, looking down at me with an expression that seemed to betoken a deep annoyance. And then, seeing me awake, there came into his face a reluctant and diplomatic kind of smile. I started to my feet, giddy and bewildered, and shook hands. "My word, you sleep sound, Lionel," he said. "So you found me out, eh? Huh. Well, I'm glad to see you, of course, but you could have let me know that you were coming. I'd have sent someone to meet you." Well, I must admit I was rather nettled at this after all the trouble that I put myself to. "What do you mean, Basil?" I'm afraid I snapped rather. "Mr. Vivian brought me your letter and that music, and so of course I came at once." "Of course, old man, of course. So how did it strike you then? Huh? I've improved a bit, I think, haven't I? No? But come on, you look wretchedly tired. Let's eat some breakfast." Well, I was about to remonstrate and mention the postscript to his letter when he looked at me with so peculiar and disagreeable a glance that the words literally stuck in my throat. I mean, the subject was perhaps too painful for him to enter upon at once, I thought, and I suppose that he'd tell everything all in his own time. The housekeeper who'd answered the door, Mrs. Hall, brought us breakfast, and now that I had the leisure to look at Basil properly, I was struck by several changes in him. I'd last seen a pale, frankly haggard youth, loose-limbed and untidy, but before me now stood a strongly built, firmly knit man, ruddy of complexion and bronze of cheek, the embodiment of robust good health. And his talk, once the surprise at my sudden arrival had worn off, was extraordinarily cheerful and amusing. Again and again he broke out into loud laughter, the firm, brisk laughter of a man full to the brim of good spirits and well-being. He talked of his work and the countryside and the people that now surrounded him, whose peculiarities he observed with much relish. And then he asked me again what I'd thought about the music that he'd sent. I started to tell him what Marcus Grayson had said, and he broke off in a loud scoff. Oh, God! Grayson? Good grief, man! And he's no better than a clergyman's widow. He'd stop his ears if you read Shakespeare out loud to him. Now, you see, my dear Lionel, I have travelled a long way since I saw you last. You know, I have found my tongue, you could say. I can now say what I mean exactly as I mean it. I mean, to hell with Grayson and the like. In fact, I can just picture his outraged, silly face now, like a pelican with a stomachache. Well, I had to admit that this was a felicitous, if discourteous, description of our friends, and I could find no words to counter it. In fact, I must say that Basil's talk, his whole bearing, fairly carried me away. And in my wearied condition, I found that I simply couldn't stand up to this radiant new personality of his. After breakfast, he showed me to a little bedroom and ordered me to sleep. He said that he had some work to do, that he was anxious to finish, but that after luncheon we'd have a stroll together. Now, I was still too tired to resist, and indeed I fell at once into another deep sleep. When I woke up, I was quite a new man, and finding no one in Basil's room, I strolled out onto the drive, where I encountered Mrs. Hall again, wearing a big flapping white sunbonnet, returning to the house with a basket in her hand. I greeted her and apologised for what might have seemed like rudeness earlier, and we fell into conversation. She'd been born in the village, she told me. Her mother had been a servant at Treheel as a girl, and until recently she and her husband had lived at a farm down in the valley and had only been in the house themselves for a year or so. Old Mr. Hill, the last owner, she explained, had died 4 years earlier, and it had proved impossible to let the place. When the trustees gave up the idea of getting a tenant, they'd offered the Halls at a nominal rent to act as caretakers. Now, she told me all this in a cheerless way, with the same strained and oppressed look that I noticed when I first met her. You'll have heard, perhaps, of Mr. Eel, sir, she said with a sudden look at me. No, I said. No, I've not heard of him. He was the old squire, sir, she said. But I think there's people here is unfair to him. He lived a wild life enough, I suppose, but he were a gentleman in his way. And I've often thought that it weren't his fault. No, I said, not really grasping what she meant. He married, you see, soon after he come into the estate, a Miss Tregaskis from down St. Earn. And they was happy together, they was. But she died after they'd only been married a couple of years, and they'd no child. And then I think that Mr. Eel, well, he went mad, shut himself up among his books, got in a bad ways, he did. But it was the sorrow inside of his heart that made him do it all. And we mustn't blame people too much for that, must we? She looked at me with a pitiful look. No, oh no, Mrs. Hall. No, I think you're quite right. You see, I think he blamed God for taking away what he loved, you see. And no good's ever going to come from that, is it? The people thereabouts, they got to hate him. He used to spoil the young people, sir. You know what I mean by that. And they was afraid of seeing about their houses. I remember seeing him once in the lane at St. Sibby. He were marching along very upright, and he passed old Mr. Miles, the church warden. Now, he'd been a wild young man himself at Mr. Miles back in the day, back before he took up with the Wesleyans. It's the first time that Mr. Miles and Mr. Eel had met since Mr. Miles had become serious. And Mr. Eel stopped and smiled, and he held out his hand. And Mr. Miles put his hands behind his back and said something about fellowship with the works of darkness. And he turned on his way. And Mr. Eel, he stood looking after him with a curious smile on his face. And, well, it's because of that smile I always pitied the man. And then he turned to me, and he saw me, and he always took a notice of me, you see, even though I were only a girl back then. And he says to me, "You see that, Mary? I'm not good enough, it seems, for Mr. Miles. Well, I don't blame him, perhaps, but you remember this, child, that a religion which makes a man turn his back on an old friend ain't a religion worth following." And as I went on, he gave a sigh, which I also still remember now. Perhaps you'd like to look at his picture, sir. He were painted at the same time as Mrs. Eel, just when they was first married. Well, I said that yes, I'd very much like to see it, and we turned to the house. She led me into a little room that looked like a study. It was here that he used to work, sir. Hours at a time, he'd write at that desk. Well, there were several shelves of books, a large knee-hole table, and on the wall a pair of portraits. One depicted a young woman, hardly more than a girl, really, dressed in white and with a delightful expression. She was very, very beautiful. And next to it was the portrait of Mr. Heel himself. Now, that too was very finely painted, with a dark background of woods against a stormy sky. It showed a young man, very slim and upright, in a claret-coloured coat. And he had a face of very great power, I thought. Big forehead, clear-cut features, a determined chin, and extraordinarily bright, large eyes. I mean, this, it was evident, was a man of great physical and mental force, who would do whatever he took in hand with all his might. And I was struck by the picture, not least by the fact that there was an extraordinary, although indefinable, likeness to Mrs. Hall herself. Now, I felt somehow that she perceived that I'd noticed this, for she made to leave the room suddenly, and I couldn't help the inference that I was compelled to draw. I lingered for a moment, looking at the picture, which was so lifelike as to give a sense of the presence of a third person in the room with you. But Mrs. Hall had left, and I understood that I was supposed to follow her. Back in the sitting room, she turned to me with some agitation. Now, I understand as you're an old friend of Mr. Netherby, sir. Yes, I like to think I'm his greatest friend, I said. Well, could you persuade him to leave this place, sir? Now, you'll think that a strange thing to say, perhaps. I like Mr. Netherby, and I'm glad enough to have a lodger, but do you think it's good for a young gentleman, well, to live so much alone as that? Well, I saw that nothing was to be gained now by reticence, so I said, all right then, Mrs. Hall, let us speak plainly. I confess that I am anxious about Mr. Netherby, and I don't mean for his health. I've never seen him look better, but I must say I sense something going on here which I don't wholly understand. She looked at me with a quick look, and then, as if deciding that I was to be trusted, she said in a low voice, that's exactly it, sir. This house is not like other houses. Mr. Eel was, well, he were a very determined gentleman, and he used to say he'd never leave this house. And, well, sir, I don't think as he has left it. Well, we both stood silent for a moment, and, well, I knew that she had spoken the truth, because as we stood there, I became aware that we were not alone in the room. The sun was bright on the woods outside. The clock ticked peacefully in a corner. But there was something unseen about us, which lay heavily on my mind. Mrs. Hall put out her hands in a deprecating way and said in a low and hurried voice, he would do no harm to me, sir. We're too near for that. And then she looked up at me, and I nodded. But I can't help it, sir, can I? If he gets different with other people. Now, Mr. Hall, my man, he's a plain good man. He'd think what I'm saying no better than madness. But as sure as there is a God in heaven, sir, Mr. Heel is here. And although he's too fine a gentleman to take advantage of my talk, yet he did like to command other people, and he went his own way too much. Now, while she spoke, this sense of oppression which I'd felt a moment before drew off, and suddenly it seemed as though we were once more alone. Mrs. Hall, I said after a moment, I must say that these things are very dark to me. And although I have heard of such things in stories, I must say I never expected to meet them in the real world. I will try what I can do to get my friend away from here, but I'm afraid that he too is a willful fellow. And in fact, even as I spoke, I heard Basil's voice outside calling me. So I took Mrs. Hall's hand in my own. She pressed it and gave me a kind, sad look. And then I went out. Well, Basil and I ate a simple lunch, and then he showed me a score that he'd just finished, written out with wonderful precision. You'll hear that later on, old friend. But now, I'd like to show you my estate. Was there ever such luck as to get a harbourage like this? I've been here for 2 months, and I think I'm going to stay forever. By the way, how long can you stay, Lionel? Oh, I must get back on Friday at the latest, I'm afraid. Lessons to teach on Saturday. Oh, no. Oh, God, it's a poor business, isn't it, teaching? I'd rather pick oakum myself. I mean, here I live in a fine house. I pay nothing for it, and all I do is write. Now, that is the life for a man. But surely, Basil, you must find it a bit lonely. Lonely? Not a bit of it. I mean, what do I want with a pack of twaddlers about me, eh? I tread a path among the stars, my friend, and I have the best of company too. He stopped and broke off rather abruptly. Really? I said. I should hardly have thought Mrs. Hall and her husband were very stimulating. By the way, she's an odd woman, isn't she? She seems so frightened. At which Basil looked at me briefly with the same expression of indefinable anger that I'd seen in his face that morning. And then he resumed. No, I just meant that I want no company but myself and my thoughts, Lionel. I tell you, if you had done as I'd done, opened a door into the very treasure house of music, you wouldn't be craving for company either. Well, I had no proper reply to make to this, and so we headed outside. And I must admit, once out, I was very taken with the beauty of the surroundings. The ground fell sharply at the back of the house, and there was a terrace with a view over a little valley, pasture fields at the bottom, crowned with low woods, and beyond, a wide prospect of uplands which lost themselves in the haze. We wandered up and down by paths and lanes, sometimes through yellowing woods, sometimes on open ground, the most perfect views bursting upon us on every side. Presently, we came upon a churchyard, surrounded by a low wall. St. Sibby, said Basil. Now, whether that was a he or a she, I've no idea, but no doubt a very estimable person. Fancy a look. It's usually open. Well, it was very plain inside the church. There were the remains of a rood loft, a few bits of ancient woodwork, but the walls were mildewed and green, and the whole place looked and smelled neglected. Vivian's a decent enough fellow, said Basil, but he's on his own here, you see. The rector's an invalid and lives at Penzance, and so poor old Vivian himself has a wretched stipend. But look, Leonard, look at here, the Heel family vault. He led me into a little chapel near the tower. It was very gloomy, but I could just about make out a monument or two and some brasses. There were a couple of helmets on iron supports and the remains of a mouldering banner, and directly opposite us, a relatively new marble slab set into the wall. Behold, said Basil, my predecessor's monument. But look at it. Did you ever see such vandalism? And when I drew near, I saw that, yes, the whole thing had been savagely defaced. There were deep dints in the marble, like the marks of hammer blows, and red stains over the inscription, which reminded me weirdly of the stains on the letter that Vivian had delivered to me. Good grief, I said. Well, who on earth did this? No one knows, said Basil, smiling. But the inscription is a bit rich, I must say. Look at this. Who discharged in an exemplary way the duties of a landowner and a Christian. I can tell you, old Heel's ideas of a landowner's duties was to screw as much as he could out of his farmers, and he had some pretty feudal ideas about his relations with the more attractive of his female tenants too, I hear. As to the Christian part of it, well, I had about as much as that, I gather, as you can take up in a two-pronged fork. All the same, yeah, you're right, they might have left the old man alone. Although I dare say he sleeps sound enough in spite of it all. And then he stamped his foot on the pavement as he did so. Are you all right in there, old boy? Perhaps not at home today. Oh, come on, Basil, I said. Don't talk like that. What? Oh, I'm sorry, old man. No, all right, no. Of course, if you don't like it. Anyway, I dare say that the old fellow can look after himself. Well, we returned home at about 4 o'clock. Basil went to ask Mrs. Hall about dinner, but I didn't feel inclined to go in just yet, and so I took a stroll down the terrace. At the end was a stone seat, and behind that, between two yews, a little dark path that led into a copse. I decided to follow this. It was a winding path and slippery with moss, and above the boughs met to block out the daylight. And then suddenly the direction turned sharply back towards the house and ended in a small flight of granite steps, which led to a low door in the corner of the building. Now, the door was painted brown like the stone of the house and was let into its frame so as to be quite flush with the wall, and the upper part was pierced with two square windows. The steps had evidently not been trodden for several months, maybe years, but upon the door near the keyhole there were clearly marks, as if it had been struck by the hoofs of some beast. Now, I don't know what it was about this place. I mean, in my life, I've seen plenty of grim and gloomy things. I witnessed death at first hand. But until that moment, I'd never experienced anything like the thrill of horror which passed through me at the sight of that little door with its dark eye-like holes. I shuddered and went back to the terrace. We ate simply again, and Basil was fuller than ever of cheerful talk and laughter. But you see, the thought of that dark path twisting like a snake among the thickets of the garden dwelt in my mind and poisoned my mood. And after dinner, I was seized with so extreme a fatigue that I drowsed off several times mid-conversation, and eventually Basil laughingly ordered me to bed. And I'm not sure whether that was the point at which Arthur broke off for the night, but there we will have our regular interval, our comfort break, so I can just relieve myself, and well, you can relieve yourselves too. Now, what's happening here? I had to. Oh no! Oh, there we are. I had to get rid of the chat because. Oh, there we are. Okay. Okay. Well, there we are. I wonder if I've missed a lot of. Anyway, let me know how it worked with me reading from the screen. It felt a bit odd to me, but was it more or less distracting? There we are. Okay, well, listen, talk among yourselves for a moment. I'm just going to go to the bathroom, and yeah, I'll see you in a sec. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas. Forgive a little solemnity now, as I would like to pay tribute to a great soul who's recently left us, Mr. Shane McGowan, a poet, and I shall now read one of his songs. A pair of brown eyes. One summer evening, drunk to hell, I stood there nearly lifeless. An old man in the corner sang Where the Water Lilies Grow. And on the jukebox, Johnny sang about a thing called love. And it's how are you, kid? And what's your name? And how do you bloody know? In blood and death neath a screaming sky, I lay down on the ground, and the arms and legs of other men were scattered all around. Some cursed, some prayed then cursed, then prayed and bled some more. And the only thing that I could see was a pair of brown eyes that was looking at me. But when we got back, labeled parts 1 to 3, there was no pair of brown eyes waiting for me. And a roving I'll go for a pair of brown eyes. I looked at him, he looked at me. All I could do was hate him, while Ray and Philomena sang of my elusive dreams. I saw the streams, the rolling hills where his brown eyes were waiting, and I thought about a pair of brown eyes that waited once for me. So drunk to hell, I left the place, sometimes crawling, sometimes walking. A hungry sound came across the breeze, so I gave the walls a talking. And I heard the sounds of long ago from the old canal. And the birds were whistling in the trees where the wind was gently laughing. And a roving I'll go. A roving I'll go. And a roving I'll go for a pair of brown eyes. Oh, there we are. Sorry, that took a bit of a time. So I'm going to have, okay, this is, again, perfectly nice beer, but they have to do my pheasant plucker. Anyway, let's see what the beer is like. Yes, I thought that, Paul. The man, it reminds me of The Man Who Went Too Far. I agree. Yes, I think you're right. It predates it, I think. So, yes, had E.F. Benson seen his brother's work before he wrote that? I don't know. It's sufficiently like it, isn't it? I wonder whether it's it reminds me of other things. I can't quite remember, though, of old friends who meet again, and one of them has changed rather. I think maybe I'm just thinking of the man who went too far. Oh, good. So the working from the screen works all right. Good. All right then. Hello, Eric Empter. Cheers. Okay, well, good. So if the working from the screen works okay, we'll continue with it for the second half. Well, we would have done anyway, but okay, so previously on Basil Netherby, the narrator had just gone for a little walk on his own, and he had seen a sinister door at the end of a sinister path set into a sinister wall. And he'd also had a strange conversation with the housekeeper, Mrs. Hall, about the previous Squire Heel. When I awoke, it was bright daytime. I dressed hastily and hurried down to find Basil waiting to give me a tour of the house. It was, as he'd said, a fine old place with some splendidly large rooms full of ancient furniture and pictures and evidence of ancient family life. He didn't take me into the study that Mrs. Hall had shown me before, but after we'd seen the dining room and a couple of rooms, he led me upstairs. And here is my space, he said, as we turned into a big chamber in the left-hand corner of the garden front. Now, there was a very large four-post bed, a sofa and some fine old chairs, a good-sized table in the window. But what attracted my notice at once was a low door in the corner of the room, half hidden behind a screen. I had a sudden moment of realization. Hey, Basil, that door in the corner there, does that communicate with the little door in the thicket outside? He turned and gave me a very long, penetrating look. Well, what an observant fellow you are, Lionel. Yes, there's a little staircase through there. Goes down into the shrubbery by the terrace. This was old Heel's room too, and he'd have visitors sometimes, who I dare say it was not convenient to admit to the house. They came and went through there, I believe, and he no doubt used the stairs himself on such occasions as he needed to. How curious, I said. I confess I don't think I'd like to sleep here myself. I didn't like the look of that shrubbery door. Really? Oh, I rather like the associations. Yeah, he was a loose old fish, of course, was Heel, no doubt about that, but he lived his life, you know. He enjoyed himself, and well, that's more than a lot of us can say, isn't it? Come on, come and have a look. He crossed the room and opened the little door, and I went in a little way. A flight of stairs led down into the darkness, at the end of which 2 square panes of the little shrubbery door glowed faintly. And I cannot account for what happened next. There was a sudden sound in the passage ahead of me, and something seemed to rush up the stairs past me, at which there fell upon me a kind of a giddiness and a nausea. It was an intense and disorienting sensation. It was absolutely horrible. And I staggered back into the room, like hands outstretched in front of me, like Elymas the sorcerer. As my vision cleared, I looked up and I saw that Basil had a strange smile on his face. Oh, what was that? I said. Something came. Did you see? Something came up the stairs. Oh, my dear fellow, said Basil. You're behaving very oddly. One would have thought you'd seen a ghost. And he looked at me with a sort of a gleeful triumph. And then he shut the door. Now, come on. We've been here quite long enough. I feel that I'm boring you. Well, that afternoon, we went on another long ramble around the estate, and I can remember little of what happened, except that Basil seemed increasingly like a man. It suddenly seemed as if he was fencing with some difficult question. I mean, his talk seemed spontaneous enough, but I felt that somehow it was that of a weak antagonist endeavouring to parry the strokes of a persistent and stronger assailant. I'm sorry, probably doesn't make sense. It's very hard to describe, but it made me distinctly uncomfortable and anxious. And it was a relief when the evening began to close in and we traced our steps and went back to the house. After dinner, Basil, for the first time, showed unmistakable signs of fatigue himself. He lit a cigar, sank back in his chair, and asked me to play something for him on the piano. Well, for a time, I simply extemporized, letting my fingers fall over the keys. But then I fell into some familiar music. And then, for some reason, I mean, perhaps it was the instinctive memory of what Basil had scrawled upon his note that influenced me, but I began to play Mendelssohn's anthem, Hear My Prayer. Now, I'd hardly come to the end of the second phrase when a sound behind me made me look over my shoulder. And I don't think I've ever received a shock like the one that I experienced then. Basil was still in the chair where he'd seated himself, but instead of the robust personality in whose presence I'd spent the last 2 days, I saw now the man that I'd known of old, only infinitely more tired and haggard than I'd ever seen him before. He was leaning towards me in an intensity of emotion and misery. Well, I stopped playing at once and I wheeled round my chair. Basil, oh, Basil, my dear friend, tell me, what has happened? He cast an agitated look about the room and then began to speak in a weak and sickly voice. And what he told me, oh dear, he led me step by step through a story so strange and so dark that I can hardly now bring myself to relate it. I imagine an untainted spirit entering cheerfully upon a cherished project and finding himself drawn in little by little into a net of overpowering evil. He told me that he'd settled at Trujillo in his normal frame of mind, that he'd intended early on to tell me of his whereabouts, but that they'd gradually stolen over him a sort of unholy influence. At first he resisted, he said, but this intrusion was accompanied by so extraordinary an access of mental power and vigour that ere long he accepted the extraordinary new conditions under which he found himself. He'd come to Grandpound in the course of his wanderings, he explained, and had inquired about lodgings. He'd been referred to Trujillo and had happily moved in at once, delighted with the mixture of quiet and dignity that surrounded him. He'd arranged his life for tranquil study. He'd chosen his rooms and he'd made the disposition he could of his own affairs. Second night that I was here, he said, I'd gone to bed thinking only of my good fortune and all the music that I'd write. I'd extinguished the light and I was lying in bed, watching the glimmer of the embers on my hearth, weaving all kinds of fancies about this marvellous house in which I found myself, when I saw, to my intense surprise, that little door in the corner of the bedroom half open and close again. Well, I thought maybe it was Mrs. Hall coming to see that I was comfortable, and I called out, "Who's there?" But there was no answer. But you see, then I heard a very disagreeable laugh. It seemed to come from the lower regions of the house in the direction of the corner. "Come in," I said, "whoever you are." And in a brief moment, the door opened and closed, and I became aware that there was someone else with me now in the room. I mean, further than that, I can only say that I became aware in a moment of the existence of a world outside of, yet intertwined with our own, a world of far stronger influences and powers than we experience in our daily lives. I mean, how far-reaching it is, I don't know, but I do know this, that all the mortal difficulties and dilemmas that I'd hitherto been obliged to meet melted away in the face of a force to which I had hitherto been a complete stranger. His first emotion, he explained, had been fright, but he became aware almost at once that the spirit who'd come was not inimical to him. Its very features, if such a word can be used about so shadowy a thing, appeared to wear a smile. And little by little, the presence of this visitant had become habitual. Basil had become used to it. There was a certain pride, it seemed, in his fearlessness, and there was also the most intense, eager curiosity. And then, he said, it began to affect me in other ways. I won't tell you how, but the very necessities of life were provided for me in a manner which I should formerly have condemned with the utmost scorn. You know, the dejection, the languorous reflections, as always used to haunt me, they drew off. You know, I became cheerful for the first time in my life, vigorous, and I admit it, I began to delight in evil imaginations. But you see, it's so subtle was the evil, so insidious, that it was not into any corruption or misdeeds that I flung myself. It was into my music that the poison flowed. But what is this thing? I asked him. Basil, I don't understand. Is it a spirit of evil? A human spirit? What? Oh, God, I don't know, he cried. And then with lifted hand, he sang in a strange voice a bar or two from Stanford's Revenge. Was he devil or man? He was devil for aught they knew. I mean, the very flippancy of this might have moved my laughter at any other time, but now I simply stared at Basil. Well, with pity, I don't know, fear, contempt, perhaps. He relapsed into a moody silence with clasped hands and knotted brow. I mean, to draw him away from the darkness of his thoughts, I asked him how the spirit had made itself plain to him. Well, not in any shape, he said. No body, no. He's there, though. And that's enough, I think. Sometimes I seem to see a face, to catch the glance of an eye, a hand raised in warning or encouragement, but it's almost always impossibly remote. You know, I could never explain to you how I see him. Well, do you see him now? I asked. Oh, yes, I do. He's a long way off, but he's running towards me very quickly. He's got far to go yet, but I can tell that he's angry. He's threatening me. He's beating the air with his hands. He means me harm, Lionel. But where? I said, where is he, Basil? I asked. His eyes were upon the ground. Oh, shut up, he suddenly said. Shut up, won't you? He is in a region of which you can know nothing. Ever could you know nothing. But it has been revealed to me. It lies all about us. It has capes and shadowy peaks and a leaden sea. It is full of sound, and it is there that I ramble with him. The silence fell, and then I spoke. Basil, please answer me this. How was it that you wrote as you did to me? He made me write to you, he said. And that's where I think he overreached himself. Or my angel that beholds the Father's face smote him down. Because suddenly I found myself, just for a moment, the miserable, abject wretch whom you see before you now. And then I wrote those despairing words on the back of the letter, and I guarded it so much that he could never come near me. And then Mr. Vivian's visit, that was not by chance, I think. I gave him the letter, and he promised to bear it faithfully. And what attempts were made to tear it from him, heaven only knows, but Vivian's a good man. Vivian would not be susceptible to that harm. But then, you see, I fell back into the old spell, and I worked more abundantly and diligently, and I produced this thrice disgusting thing which shall not live to scatter evil abroad. And as he said these words, he rose and he tore the score that lay on the table into shreds and crammed the pieces into the fire. And then, as he thrust the last pieces down, the poker that he was holding fell from his hands, and he turned white as a sheet, and he started trembling. Basil, what's the matter? I said. He's arrived. Oh, He's here. He turned a terrible look on me, and then all at once I was aware of a sort of darkness in the room. And with a growing horror, I gradually perceived that in and through the room now there ran a thing like the front of a precipice, with some dark strand at its foot on which beat a surge of phantom waves. The two scenes struggled together. At one time I could plainly see this cliff front close beside me, and the lamp and the firelit room all dimmed to vanishing, and then suddenly the room would come back into focus and the cliff would die into a steep shadow. But in either of the scenes, Basil and I were there. He, standing irresolute and despairing, glancing from side to side like a hare when the hounds close in. Once he spoke, and this was when the cliff was looming up so suddenly. "There are others with him," he said. And then in a moment it seemed as if the room in which we sat died away altogether, and I was entirely in that other place. There was a faint light as from under a stormy sky, and a little further up the strand a group of dark figures which seemed to consult together. All at once the group broke and came suddenly towards us. I do not know what to call them. I mean, they were human in a sense. That is, they walked upright and had hands and heads, but the faces were blurred and fretted like half-rotted skulls. It's impossible to describe in words. I only know that I had seen ugliness and corruption at the very source and looked into the darkness of the pit itself. The forms eluded me and rushed upon Basil, who made a motion as though to seize hold of me, and then he turned and fled, his arms outstretched, glancing behind him as he ran, and in a moment he was lost to view. And I don't know what happened after that. I think I tried to pray, but I presently became aware that I was myself in danger. It seemed as though one figure had separated himself from the rest and returned to seek me. And this figure carried something which he swung and shook in his hand, which I thought was a token to be shown to me. And then I found my voice, and I cried out with all my strength to God to save me. And in a moment, there was the firelit room again, and the lamp. The most peaceful-looking room in England, but Basil was not in it. The door was wide open, and in a moment Mr. Hall and his wife came hurrying in. I made some pitiful excuses. I dozed off in my chair and had woken myself up with a cry. For in the quest I was about to engage in, I did not wish that any mortal should accompany me. They left me clearly suspicious of my manner. Indeed, Mrs. Hall glanced at me with so penetrating a look that I felt that she understood something of what had happened. And then I went up into Basil's room. It was dark, and a strong wind was blowing in from the little door in the corner. I stepped across the room, felt my way down the stairs, and finding the door open at the bottom, I went out into the snake-like path. Some yards along it, there came a sudden gap in the trees to the left, and in the moonlight I could see the pale fields and the corner of the wood casting its black shadow on the ground. The shrubs were torn and trampled here, as though some heavy thing had crashed through. I made my way cautiously down, and a moment later, I saw Basil. He lay some distance out in the field on his face. I knew at a glance that he was dead. And when I lifted him, I became aware that he was in some strange way mangled too. It was found afterwards that although the skin of his body was hardly contused, almost every bone in his body was crushed or shattered. I managed to carry him to the house, and I closed the door of the staircase. And then I somehow communicated to the Halls that Basil had had a fall and that he was dead. And then my own strength failed me, and for 3 days and nights I lay in a kind of stupor. When I recovered my consciousness, I found myself in bed in my own room. Mrs. Hall nursed me with motherly care and tenderness, and that moved me very greatly. But I could not speak of the matter to her until, just before my departure, she came in, as she did 20 times a day, to see if I wanted anything. And then I made a great effort, and I said, "Mrs. Hall, I'm very sorry for you. This has been a terrible business, and I'm afraid that you will not easily forget it. You ought, I think, to leave this house." She paused and then spoke. "No, sir. My duty is to this house now, and I'll never leave it. But I will ask you, sir, to try and find a sort of pity in your heart for him." I knew that she didn't mean Basil. "You see, I don't think as he knows what he's done. He must have his will, as he always did. He stopped at nothing if it was for his pleasure, and he just didn't know the harm what he did. But he's in God's hands now. And although I can't understand why, yet there are things in this life which God allows to be. And we must not try to be judges ourselves. We must try to be merciful. But I've not done what I could have done. And if God gives me strength, there shall be an end of this." A few hours later, Mr. Vivian called to see me, a very different person to the man that had visited me in Holborn. He asked me no questions, but he told me a few details. He said that they decided at the inquest that Basil had fallen from the terrace. The doctor had said to Mr. Vivian that a fall it must have been, but a fall of almost inconceivable character. And what is more, the doctor had added, the man was neither in pain nor agitation of mind when he died. His face was absolutely peaceful and tranquil. His theory was that he had died from a sudden seizure. So I held my tongue. One thing I did, though, however, was to leave a marker over the body of my friend, a simple slab with name and date, and to this I ventured to add one line, "And in their hands they shall bear thee up," because I had no doubt in my mind that Basil was suddenly delivered, although not from death. One further word. About a year after these events, I received a letter from Mr. Vivian, which I'll read to you now without further comment. St. Sibby, December the 18th, 1894. "Dear Mr. Ward, I write to tell you that our friend Mrs. Hall died a few days ago. She was a very good woman, one of the few that are chosen. I was much with her in her last days, and she told me a strange thing which I cannot bring myself to repeat to you. But she sent you a message which she repeated several times, which she said you would understand. It was simply this: 'Tell Mr. Ward I have prevailed.' I may add that I have no doubt of the truth of her words, and you will know to what I am alluding. The day after she died, there was a fire at Treheal. Mr. Hall was distracted with grief at the loss of his wife, and I do not know quite what happened, but it was impossible to save the house. All that is left of it is a mass of charred ruins with a few walls standing up. Nothing was saved, not even a picture. There is wholly inadequate insurance, and I believe that it is not intended to rebuild. I hope that you will think of us occasionally. Although I know you so little, I shall always feel that we have a common experience which will hold us together. Try and visit us some day, perhaps, when the memory of what took place is less painful to you. The grass is now green on your poor friend's grave, and I will only add that you will have a warm welcome from me. I'm just moving into the rectory, as my old rector died a fortnight ago, and I've accepted the living. God bless you, dear Mr. Ward. Yours very sincerely, James Vivian. Yeah, well, I think, to be honest, yeah, okay. I think if you say, look, makes my light up very white. I think if you look back at others, it's more or less the same. Oh, so there we are. That was Basil Netherby. Yeah, I think that's an edited version of it. The original, which you can read if you buy the anthology Ghosts of the Chit Chat, which is available either on Amazon or from Swan River Press website. You can read the original of that as well as an introduction to it that I've written. It's a bit longer than that. It's a bit wordier. Arthur Benson, for whom I have increasing admiration, he was a very wordy man. Yeah. Ah. Exactly. It's still available. If anyone wants to buy this book, you can buy it directly from me and get it signed if you email me. I still have a few copies left. Now I'm just going to replenish my nut bowl, if you don't mind. So, as I say, what I've been doing between Christmas and New Year is putting the finishing touches to an anthology of ghost stories by friends of M.R. James, which comes as a successor to Ghost of the Chit Chat. And there's a couple of discoveries. I'm not going to shake the world to its foundations, but which will be of interest to followers of M.R. James. Yeah, Belinda, that was his brother E.F. Benson, the Gautier Perambulans. Yeah. And it's also like another of E.F. Benson's that Paul mentioned above, called The Man Who Went Too Far. And E.F. Benson is responsible for having had this story published in the first place. I guess it's possible that he may have edited the manuscript that he found, and that's why there are some similarities. I don't know. So hopefully this new book, I don't know when it'll be out, but I'll be submitting it to Swan River Press next week, and always takes a few months to, a bit of back and forth between me and the publisher, and then he's got to fit it into his schedule. But I'm hoping by the autumn, at the latest, it'll be out. It's out of my hands, really, and I've spent far too long doing it. I should have finished it over a year ago. I think it will, Anthony. I think it will have a cover by John Coulthard. I think it'll be marketed as it'll be branded like the other one. Different picture, of course, but along those lines, I hope. So, don't know. And people are from London. I've got some shows in London coming up, which could do with shifting a few tickets. If you go to the Nunkie website, look at the schedule. February, I've got a couple of nights in London, a couple of nights in Bristol. The Archive of Dread is hitting the road again in the summer, so look out for that. Right. South End Cliffs Pavilion. I don't know, Peter. I'll look it up. Is it on the pier? I'd like to do a pier theatre. Yeah, thank you. I'll make a note of that and look it up. Yeah, All right. Thank you for enjoying the Nunkie Arms. Thank you for coming. I hope to see you again soon. Maybe in about a month, we'll do another Nunkie Arms. All right. Good night. Yeah. Yeah.
Marie's, yeah. She wants it.